So today I'm going to talk to you about a program we're currently developing at the University of Auckland, the Center for Brain Research. That's called the MovinCog initiative. And I encourage you to check our website if you don't know about that program yet. I'll link to that throughout the presentation. But so basically the idea is that we're working on developing a remediation program for learning difficulties that's going to be evidence-based and free of charge. Right. Thank you. That's it for me today. All right. So I want to start with two little pictures here showing cells in the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is a structure deep into the brain that's responsible for a lot of things, among which memory formation and some sort of spatial orientation. So it's a very important structure in the brain that's damaged very early on in Alzheimer's disease, for example. And that's key in a lot of behaviors, in a lot of things that we're doing every day. Now, here we're looking at two identical rats, the hippocampus of two identical rats, A and B. And there's only one difference between the two. And we see that this difference leads to a very important difference in terms of cell proliferation. So you see that at the top, we have very little cells, those little black dots. And at the bottom, we see those new cells. There are quite a few more. There's only one difference between the two. You know what that is? Physical exercise. That's right. Or perhaps more generally here, something like that. So the second animal that we saw before had constant access for a few weeks to a running wheel. And this is the only difference, and yet you see tremendous consequences in terms of cell proliferation. So I'll get back to this throughout the presentation, but I just wanted to start with a visual so you can see really what happens deep down in the brain. And even though we know of the benefits of physical exercise in our lives, we're still running in some kind of paradoxical behaviors, right? Where we have the knowledge, but we don't necessarily apply it throughout. We don't necessarily apply it in every aspect of our lives. Now, physical exercise to date has been established as the most reliable way to create new neurons, the best. There are possibly other ways to boost the creation of new neurons, but if there's one that has been established as the best way, that's physical exercise. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? Now, do you know how many cognitive remediation programs use the science of physical exercise in their program, in their kind of intervention? 0. None. That's a shame, isn't it? Because we now understand that the brain is plastic, that it can change throughout life. In fact, neuroplasticity is ubiquitous. You've heard of the term, I'm sure, even if your area of work is not neuroscience or cognitive psychology. It's all over in the news, in the media. And that's a good thing, right? Because plasticity does matter. So here you're looking at a plot that shows the correlation or the association between brain plasticity and brain fitness in Google searches last year. So what we're doing basically is that among the people who Google brain plasticity, we count how many of them click on a link related to brain fitness, right? And so the correlation that you see here, 0.67, is pretty high. Just to give you an idea, a correlation of 0 would mean that everybody Googling brain plasticity ends up clicking on other pages that are not related to brain fitness, when a correlation of 1, and that's the range, 0 to 1, a correlation of 1 would mean that everybody Googling brain plasticity ends up clicking on pages related to brain fitness in some kind of systematic behavior, right? So 0.67, you can see it's fairly high in this case. And the reason I'm showing you this here is because from this we can infer that the reason people care about brain plasticity is because it brings the potential to change, right? It puts them back into the driver's seat. It brings hope. And in fact, there are reasons to be optimistic. So we now know that we lose neurons across the lifespan overall, but we create new neurons locally, and the hippocampus that I talked about earlier is a good example of that. We also know that synapses, the connection between neurons, remain plastic throughout the lifespan. And so those are really good news for us, right? Our brain health and the potential to remediate learning disorders. Now, because we're dealing with very emotional statements, bringing hope to people, I think it's also very important to be straightforward and to be precise about what this means and what this doesn't mean, and about what we know and don't know at the moment. So just because the brain is plastic does not mean that any training regimen can lead to meaningful improvements, right? You have to find a way to trigger something that will have some kind of meaning in your life, that will change something that you can use, as opposed to just something that can be visible on a test, for example, in the lab. And many popular brain training games are not supported by scientific evidence, even though they're rational, sound sciencey. So I'm sure you've heard of a lot. I'm sure you've gone on some of those websites. And really, when you take a look at what's out there, it really sounds like they've done tons of research. And so it's easy to be fooled. But in fact, it's often not the case. And transfer, what we call transfer, is any kind of improvement on tasks or domains that were not part of the training regimen. So you're training on something, and it transferred to something else that you did not train on. So for some of you who know CogMed, for example, you would train on working memory and hope that it brings you benefit in your life in terms of attention, things like that. So that would be an example of transfer. And transfer in that line of research really remains the exception rather than the norm. It's good to keep in mind. Transfer is really hard to get, and in fact, it's been tried for decades by psychologists in the lab with very little results. Now, these limitations in the current picture of cognitive enhancement and cognitive remediation led us to propose a new approach, one that brings together the latest evidence in neuroscience. And so this slide here is key. In fact, if you understand this slide, you get what I've been working on for the past decade. I know it doesn't really speak too highly of what I'm doing, but that's true. So we base our rationale on the fact that physical exercise helps to generate new neurons, right? A process that's called neurogenesis. Yet, if you don't do anything with those neurons, they die out within a few weeks. If you don't retain those new neurons within your neural network, they're going to die out within a few weeks at most, right? And one of the best ways we know to retain those neurons within the network is to learn something new, to challenge your brain. Learning. Now, based on those two lines of research, we've proposed a new approach that combines the two so as to maximize the chances that we'll get some kind of meaningful improvement after training. So we've been testing this idea in a randomized control experiment in which we compare physical exercise, brain training, and a hybrid version that combine some form of physical exercise with some cognitive demands as well. Now, for the next two slides, keep in mind that physical exercise is in blue, brain training in red, and the hybrid version in orange. Now, this is a bit of a spoiler, but after 8 weeks of training, the hybrid version was the best both for the body and for the brain. Now, let me unpack that a little bit. So we took a look at resting heart rate in terms of physiological measures. And so up to a point, what you need to know is that the lower the better. I'm sure a lot of you know. And so low heart rate is associated with less cardiovascular diseases, less diabetes, things like that, and more generally, better general health. What you can see here is that brain training did not lead to any kind of change, right? That's the red curve. We expected that. People were just sitting in front of a computer for 8 weeks. Well, we'll let them go home at some point, but bottom line is they were sitting in front of a computer with us, and that's all they were doing. So that was a very cognitive form of training. just like a lot of you might know. And so we didn't expect any change, but if you look at the two programs that included physical exercise, you see that their heart rate is going down. So those are weeks here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And so throughout the weeks, you can see that heart rate is going down for those who exercise. And in fact, if you take a look at blood pressure, systolic and diastolic, you see more or less the same thing. It's a bit more noisy in a way, so it's not maybe as clear, but the idea is the same. So the bottom line here is that people were getting healthier throughout the program. We also kept track of cognitive abilities. So here I'm going to present you two constructs which are aggregate of tasks together. So we did not measure one cognitive ability with just one task. It's pretty bad practice in science. So we tried to get a lot of tasks together that measure the same thing so that you can reduce any kind of variability that's not due to the ability that you want to measure. And so we measured spatial ability and working memory capacity. And what you see here is that in terms of spatial ability, the hybrid version was the best. Again, this is in orange. When it comes to working memory capacity, the hybrid version was as good as brain training, which, by the way, was targeting working memory capacity directly. So this is important because spatial ability and working memory capacity are very important abilities in everyday life. They're good predictors of success in schools, in professional fields, and in many domains of our lives. So what do we think is happening here? Well, first, physical exercise primes the brain for learning. Cognitive training provides the material for growth on top of that. And so either approach alone is suboptimal. If you just do one of those, you're not maximizing your chances to get some kind of improvement. And so by designing some kind of hybrid approach that combines the two, hopefully we're maximizing those chances. Now, even in the absence of a problem, enhancing the capabilities of the brain can be life-changing. And we all could use a little boost, regardless of the specific set of cognitive abilities that we've been working on or that we've been developing throughout our lives. Now, joking aside, you might be wondering to what extent this applies to non-clinical populations. I don't like the term, but that's the idea. This has all been done with healthy individuals that did not have any kind of problem in particular. And so the extent to which it applies to cognitive remediation, I'll try to cover in the next few slides. So cognitive remediation is a bit of a different problem than cognitive training in general, right? In cognitive remediation, you have a particular problem, weak abilities that need to be remediated. And so in a way, it's a bit more straightforward as well. There's a clear goal here. With brain training, you don't really know what you have to do. Maybe there are some trade-offs. If you improve one ability, maybe another one is going down. It's a possibility. With cognitive remediation, you already know what you have to do because all you need to do is target those abilities that are debilitating for one kind of disorder. And so the overall goal is really to allow those individuals to function normally in day-to-day settings, or whether in schools or in professional areas or anything really that they would like to participate in. And so knowledge that we can gain from cognitive training really can inform cognitive remediation. And I'll try to show you how in the next few minutes. So we're launching an initiative that was born from the idea that too few individuals have access to the cognitive remediation programs that they need. And this might be due to financial cost. This might be due to limited evidence for those programs. And so I don't know about you, but we don't think having financial means should be the requirement to get access to a program. So we're in the process of designing, testing, and implementing an evidence-based training program that will be free of charge. And for that, we're using state-of-the-art neuroscience techniques. And so I'm not bringing that up to show off, but just to say that we're going to base all those results on solid evidence before we release it. So we're doing things a bit of the backward way in this field, where we're testing first and then we're releasing to the consumers. But we believe it's the right way to do so. So if you look at those techniques, just for those of you who might be interested, this is EEG, this is fMRI, and DTI at the bottom. So basically, those are different techniques that are being used nowadays, and they just allow answering different questions. And so I just want to give you a quick overview of the program, what it will include. So we're going to have a physical component. I'll be foolish to present all that to you and then not include any. So that's the idea here. We're gonna use high-intensity training, and the idea is to pack a lot of physical exercise in a very short amount of time. And we're hoping to target 2 core mechanisms. There are going to be priming children for learning, and also some neurophysiological mechanisms based on dopamine and BDNF in the brain that are going to promote the growth of new cells. Now, how we're going to do that? So there'll be no need for special equipment or facilities, and the program is going to be standardized. So there'll be no need to train instructors. So this is our gift to you guys if you're teachers or anybody who wants to implement that in their classroom. You won't have to go through frantic sessions of jumping jacks in front of your students. We're going to do it for you so you don't have to. Now, on top of that, we're going to include a cognitive component as well. And the idea here is to target different kind of learning disorders with one single program. So that's a bit of a tricky question. The way we're going to do that is through adaptive training. So the software is going to adapt to core deficits. It's going to adapt to core deficits by allocating more time to tasks where performance is lower, right? So you're going to spend a lot of time on things you need and a bit less time on things that you don't need, but you don't necessarily start from a diagnosis. You start from an assessment that's been done by the software in this case. And so this allows combining domain general tasks that might be needed for everyone and domain-specific tasks that might be particularly needed for people that have some specific kind of disability. And so the program has already led to the publication of a technical report a few months ago. That's on our website. And it provides an overview of popular training programs, at least here in New Zealand, and the strength of evidence that's associated with their claims. So if you're interested, I'll link to the website at the end of the talk. One thing I want to bring up here, though, is that to the extent that we can, and we'll strive to do that throughout our research program, we're trying to be open access so that you can have access to anything we publish. So basically what it means for the report is pretty straightforward. It's posted on our website, but what it means for peer-reviewed publications is that we'll pay a fee upfront so that you don't have to, right? We'll pay a fee upfront so that it's open access and that anybody can check our findings. Now, this might lead to a question that I often get, which is the durability of those changes, right? How long-lasting are those improvements? And I think there's a bit of confusion here that comes from the level of investigation of those claims. So if you're looking at the neural level, your brain changes constantly. In fact, after this talk, your brain won't be the same, hopefully for the best. But the idea is that any kind of program, even meaningless training programs, will change your brain. That's not what you should aim for. Changing your brain is not good or bad. It's just a thing that happens throughout life, right? So if you look at the neural level, anything changes constantly. Now, clearly that's not what people want to know when they ask the question, right? They want to know if those effects in terms of behavior, in terms of cognitive abilities are long-lasting. And that's a different question in this case. And I really think that for a lot of those programs, it's maybe a bit of a bleak picture, but once you stop training, it's very likely that you go back to whatever the demands of the environment trigger, which if you stop training are probably going to go down, right? So your cognitive abilities are not going to be targeted anymore, and so it's likely that it's going to go down slightly. Now, what are we hoping to do in terms of cognitive remediation, as I'm sure a lot of you know, is to give kids a bit of a boost so that then they can use those newly developed abilities to do other things. and that the training becomes the environment rather than the training that we're implementing. We don't want to put people on MovinCog for 10 years. We want to give them a little bit of a boost, and then the environment, being the classroom and everything else, will take over. Now, there's a little bit of a, this brings another idea, I think, that I need to talk about just quickly, what's been called the stability plasticity dilemma that was talked about in '85 already. So that's kind of a long time ago. And so the idea is that the plasticity of the brain is not bad or good, as I just alluded to. In fact, a system that would be too plastic would not be able to retain something that you've learned. So your brain, if it changed constantly, would not be able to retain what you've learned. It would just change constantly, and so your synapses and your neurons will just change so much that your memories, for example, will vanish. So that's not something you want. On the other end of the spectrum, a brain that's too stable, that's fixed, wouldn't be a good thing either, because you wouldn't be able to learn something new. So guess what? Evolution already came up with a solution to that, which is having a brain that's highly plastic in the first few years of life, so you can learn a lot of stuff because you're not born with knowing so much. But then, as you get older, and that's age that we have here, this plasticity of the brain goes down. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing because it favors retaining those things that you've learned already. But what it also means is that any kind of change that you want to trigger is going to take more effort. It's just good to keep in mind when we're dealing with things in this field. And speaking of things we need to keep in mind, I know there are lots of teachers and educators, school principals here today. So I wanted to give you a few applications of this line of research, a few thoughts of what can be done to apply this kind of knowledge to the classroom. So first of all, children do not pay attention to boring things, right? We all know that. So this seems obvious, but what it means is that novelty and diversity are key here. And in fact, in developmental psychology, there's an entire field of research that's called preferential looking paradigm. That's based on this idea. So infants don't have the ability to speak, right? And it's a bit of a snag if you're researchers doing research on developmental psychology because you're trying to design experiments and you don't know what your subjects would like to say. So experiments came up with a clever idea, which is to use looking time as a window into the brain. And one finding that really has been quite systematic in this line of research is that children pay attention to novel things. They look at novel things for longer. And so this starts already early on, but even as you grow up, it's still the case. Another thing I think that is important to remind you of is that transfer or the generalization of knowledge emerges given sufficient encounters with new content. So you need to have multiple explanations of the same thing, and if possible, varying the sensory modality of those things that you're trying to present, of that content you're trying to talk about or you're trying to cover. So one example of that would be combining maybe a more traditional approach when you explain a concept with something that rests upon observation or gestures, so that you can combine visual and motor sensory modalities to ensure that everybody gets a way to understand the content that you're trying to convey. Now, I'm not going to give you specific examples. I know you'll come up with much better ones being teachers and dealing with kids every day. And finally, it's good to keep in mind that every brain is different. Now, importantly, that does not mean that we should adapt every single situation, right? But what that means is that if we can offer a variety of situations that can give a chance for everyone to learn, then we're maximizing the chances that a lot of kids in the classroom can learn something new. Now, to some extent, a lot of the good practices when it comes to your brain are not based on miracle cures. But instead, they're consistent with what you already know to look after your body. So here we have an example of nutrition, good sleep cycles, stress reduction, and setting goals. Now, this is a bit of a plain contrast with marketing claims from many of the cognitive training programs we've heard of. And so, no brain training company is talking about this. Now, the reason you're not hearing about this often from companies is pretty simple here. You can't really sell common sense. There's no money to be made here. And it all comes down to who you want to be. Do you want to be an individual making informed decisions based on the latest evidence? Or do you want to be one susceptible to, whoever speaks louder, to follow whoever speaks louder, to follow any kind of claim that can be made on those websites? Now, there's a quote from the 1998 movie Rounders with Matt Damon playing a gambler in the game of poker. I think it's quite interesting here. You don't want to be that person, so you need to stay informed, you need to stay up to date. And part of the MovinCog initiative is about informing general audiences. It's about doing this for you in a way. Because we have no financial motives with any of those programs, we're hoping that we can give you an objective assessment of them, and so that you can have a reliable source, a go-to reference if you need to. One of the first things that I want to mention here about this is that you need to be skeptical of quick fixes promising large effects. What justifies the change? And really, there's a good example of that was tried a few years ago in the United States and Canada, where in response to very disappointing academic achievement, policies were implemented to reduce physical exercise and to promote math and core subjects like English instead. And guess what? Grades got even lower. Right? There's some kind of balance in a child's day, throughout the day, and if you disrupt that balance, you need to really ask yourself if it's really something that's based on evidence and if it's going to lead to something substantial. Now, another thing that I want to point out here is that the burden of proof is on those who design or implement a training program. That's very important here. As long as you don't demand evidence, they're not going to do the research. There's no need. You're still buying the program. If one of your requirements before buying a training program, before putting your money and your kid into that, is to say, I want to see the evidence, then all of a sudden, doing this kind of scientific research becomes a priority number one. And so we put up, in the field of cognitive remediation, we've put up with things that we don't put up with anywhere else. We've talked about the pharmaceutical industry, right? We hear a lot about this and about bad pharma and everything they're doing. But if there's one thing that they're not doing, is exactly what's happening in cognitive remediation at the moment. So if you want to release a new drug, it needs to go through extensive trials before you can use it. And in fact, there are even safeguards, just in case you're a bit of a nutcase and you want to try that drug before it went to any of that, you're not allowed to do it. You're not allowed to do it. And yet that's exactly what we're doing with cognitive remediation programs that have not been tested. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, that's not exactly the same thing, right? We're not putting a foreign substance in our body and in our brain. Well, maybe you're right, but maybe not. There are opportunity costs. Those programs cost a lot. Sometimes you have to go through an entire different routine, 1 hour drive in the morning to get to that specific school that can offer that program. It's a substantial change, right? It's just something to keep in mind, the idea of opportunity cost, right? What you could have been doing as opposed to this program that's not being researched, what you could have been doing for your kid. Maybe some music lessons, maybe physical exercise, things that have been proven to work. And so there are just a few things I want to leave you with. On a bit of a brighter note, I'll try. So if there's one thing that we know today is that neuroscientific evidence shows that meaningful cognitive changes are possible, right? And I want to emphasize here on meaningful, which that's what we're striving for. Now, that being said, a one-size-fits-all approach is not realistic Each individual is different in their response to training. Some are going to benefit a lot from one type of training. Some are not going to benefit a lot from the same type of training. And sometimes it's very hard to predict beforehand what's going to happen. One thing to keep in mind as well is that significant change take time and effort. So anytime you hear of something, some quick fix that can do some things very quickly and permits large effect, you can, I'm done. Okay. You should be skeptical of that. And so basically, the idea is to combine approaches so as to maximize the improvements that we can get and the meaningful gains. And that's all for me. Thank you.